Back in 2008, Emil Velisti and Andy Schwartz demonstrated that it was possible to decode the neural signals coming out of the motor cortex in real time to allow a monkey to feed himself marshmallows using a robotic arm. This was a phenomenal proof of concept. It showed that humans in the near future could become cyborgs and overcome the limitations of any kind of paralysis. In 2012, a team from Andy Schwartz's lab demonstrated that it was possible to extend these results to humans for the first time. And here we can see a woman taking her first self-controlled sip of coffee in 15 years. All of this can't come soon enough. The Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation has commissioned research finding that as many as 1 in 50 Americans are suffering from some form of paralysis disorder. This is a huge number of people who require large amounts of care and suffer from a lack of independence in their lives. What's more, the general underlying principle that allows this decoding of neural signals to take place is actually phenomenally simple. In the papers that Andy Schwartz and his colleagues published about their robotic arm experiments, they showed that it was possible to use a simple linear decoder to tell where the patient wanted to move the robotic arm. Simply put, imagine that neuron A likes to fire more whenever the patient is trying to move the arm upwards, and fires less whenever the patient is trying to move the arm downwards. If you took the activity from several different neurons, some of them that have an up-down bias in their firing, some of them with a left-right bias in their firing, maybe some of them fire more when the participant is trying to make the arm grasp versus open, and so on, then you can see that quickly it would become possible to decode the motions that the patient is trying to make the arm undergo in real time, simply by looking at this kind of one-to-one sort of mapping between firing rates of individual neurons and motion of the arm. This idea that there's some kind of a one-to-one mapping between the physical space that the arm moves through and the neural firing rates that are being recorded from inside the brain has worked its way into decoding algorithms being used by Elon Musk's company Neuralink. Here you can see a monkey who is controlling the cursor of a computer using only the neural activity in his mind. And the descriptions that Neuralink has published, both in this video and then also in their blog on their website, indicate that they're using the same type of decoding algorithm that Andy Schwartz and other researchers like him have pioneered. Basically put, trying to find the individual tuning of individual neurons, and then combining that information through a multiple linear regression. In fact, the big challenge in implementing this type of thing in humans, really, has been the hardware. If you look at the experiments that were done by Schwartz's lab and others like them in monkeys, most of these experiments involved having large amounts of hardware that stuck out through the scalp. And that's even true in the human experiment that we looked at just now. You can see those big boxes sitting on top of the participant's head. No one wants to walk around with big boxes sticking out of their head, and what's more, it's a big infection risk. By contrast, you can see in the video from Neuralink, they seem to have solved the problem. They have created neural implants that are so small that it's possible to have them entirely covered underneath the scalp, and once the hair regrows, there's no way to even tell that they're there. So problem solved. Neuralink has come up with the engineering to make the devices small enough and efficient, and science has come up with the decoding algorithm, which is easy. It's just a linear decoder. Well, turns out it's not quite so simple. In the research I'm going to tell you about today, Karen Shroeder, working in Mark Churchland's lab, and several of their colleagues, they were training monkeys to navigate in virtual reality. And they wanted to know, is it possible to collect neural signals from the motor cortex of the monkeys and decode where it is that the monkeys are trying to move in virtual reality in real time? And in so doing, they wanted to know, can they take away the need for the monkey to drive themselves in virtual reality? Use only the computer, which is based on the monkey's neural activity, to drive the monkey through virtual reality. And initially, they were hoping they might be able to do something similar to what Andy Schwartz and Neuralink are trying to do with some sort of a linear decoder. If you can just map aspects of the physical, or in this case virtual world, onto the activity of the neurons, then you have a one-to-one mapping and you have an easy linear decoder. The problem they found is that it wasn't quite so simple. It turns out that the brain doesn't necessarily code things in the way that we think might be the most intuitive. Hi there. I'm Adam Dede, and welcome to a Neuroscience Journal Club, where I bring you a description of a recently published article in the world of neuroscience. So, the goal that Karen Shroeder and her colleagues were trying to go after was seeing if they could train a brain-computer interface, or a brain-machine interface, a BMI, to decode a monkey's intended motion in virtual reality in real time. And the task that they were using was really pretty simple. Initially, monkeys were trained to turn a pedal in a forward direction whenever they were in a lush green virtual environment, and in a backward direction whenever they were in a tan, more desert-like virtual environment. They had to turn the pedal until they reached lit-up squares on the ground of the environment, and when they reached these lit-up squares, they had to stop and receive a reward. And here on the screen right now, you can see what the task looked like from the monkey's point of view. And on the left side, the monkey is driving the motion of his virtual avatar through the environment by turning the pedal. But on the right side, the motion of the monkey through the virtual environment is being controlled entirely by the monkey's mind. Now, yes, you can still see the monkey's hand flitting on and off the screen as he turns the pedal, but he's only turning the pedal out of habit, and that's not actually driving it anymore. So the big question that we're going to want to ask, what exactly is the algorithm that Shroeder and her colleagues came up with to decode the monkey's brain activity in order to allow him to drive through the virtual environment using his mind? Because whatever that algorithm is, it's going to tell us something about how it is that the brain actually encodes information. So in the arm and Neuralink experiments that we talked about earlier in the video, the way the decoding was being done was using a simple linear decoder, which means that there's a vector of weights, and that vector has the same number of elements in it as there are neurons being recorded by the system. Each of the weights indicates how much the variable that's being predicted, say the X position of the robotic arm or the X position of a mouse cursor, is loaded onto that particular neuron. And maybe one neuron has a lot of loading and one neuron has not so much. But if you multiply all of the weights by all of the instantaneous firing rates of all the neurons and sum it all up, you get a single point estimate for where the algorithm believes the monkey wants the cursor to be at that particular moment in time, or wants the robotic arm to be at that particular moment in time. So here, the question was, would a simple linear decoder, similar to that that's been used in robotic arm and cursor experiments, would that work for this pedal experiment as the monkey is navigating through virtual space? Now, intuitively, it seems like it should work. If it's the case that it works for reach, why wouldn't it work for navigation through the virtual environment? The pedal task involves using the hand, just like the reaching task does. So if the way that the motor cortex encodes motion in the hand is constant across all different tasks that you can do with your hand, then you would expect that once you come up with an algorithm to decode hand motion in one task, that same algorithm should work for other tasks. But sadly, as you may have guessed by now, Shroeder and her colleagues found that that wasn't the case. So more specifically, what they found was that although the R squared was quite high for predicting the motion of the monkey through virtual space when they used these more traditional decoding variables like X position, Y position, and so on, the amount of the neural variance, the amount of variance in the neural signal that was being accounted for by these traditional variables was quite small. So let's unpack that a little bit and see what it means. So on the graph that you're looking at here, the orange dots represent the R squared value, or how good the model was at predicting certain aspects of the motion of the monkey's hand. So we can see X position, Y position, X velocity, Y velocity, and angular or rotational velocity. And these are just aspects of the monkey's hand motion, which we have veridical measurements for. So what you can see is that we're accounting for about 60% of the variance in these hand motions, which is pretty good. It's not bad. But on the flip side, the way you could ask this question is how much of the variability in the neural signal is actually being used in this decoding operation. And it turns out that's actually very small. That's less than 5%. So there's a lot of variability in the neural signal that's not being used at all. There's a lot of changes in neuron firing rates that are happening but don't have any impact in the way this algorithm is decoding hand position. So what does that mean? What's going on there? What is that variability? So one way you could think about this is imagine that you're standing on a bridge in a foreign country where you don't speak the language at all. And the police have just heard that upriver from the bridge that you're standing on, there's been a dam burst. So there's about to be a flood. And a police officer comes running up to you on the bridge. He's waving wildly. Maybe he even pushes you a little bit. He's talking very quickly. You don't understand anything that he's saying, not a word, but yet you get off the bridge. And in that way, you've understood a very small amount of what he said. You've managed to get the point that you needed to get off the bridge. And in that way, maybe you've saved yourself from being hurt in the flood. But it's certainly not like you really understood what's going on. It's not a perfect transmission of information. And something like that seems to be going on here in decoding the motion of the monkey's hand using these traditional variables, these X position, Y position type of variables. This imperfection in the decoding became really apparent when they took a look at it on a single trial level. So here in this graph, what you're seeing is on the y-axis angular velocity, on the x-axis time, and the black is the true motion of the monkey's hand. And then in teal, we can see what the decoder thought the monkey was doing. So imagine now that you're using a decoder like this to try and drive a wheelchair, which might be one of the eventual applications for technology like this kind of algorithm. So here we can see that there are some times when there's motion predicted by the decoder, but the monkey's hand is actually still. That's a pretty big problem. If you think about waiting to cross a street and you're in your wheelchair, you don't want to accidentally start moving into the street when you don't mean to. And then here you can see forward motion being predicted by the decoder when actually the monkey's hand was moving backwards. So yeah, the decoder is doing an okay job overall, but if we want to use this kind of technology in human brain-machine interfaces, pretty good is not good enough. It's got to be perfect. So Shroeder and her colleagues developed an algorithm that managed to use more of the variance in the neural signal. It spoke the brain's language more closely. The core of the decoder was a set of 4 vectors, where each of those vectors was a set of weights on all of the neurons. And importantly, 2 of them described a space for forward motion, and 2 of them described a space for backward motion. So the way this would work is, imagine you take the 2 vectors that describe the forward space. One of them defines one axis of that forward space, and the other one describes another axis of that forward space. Then, by multiplying these vectors by all of the neural activity at any particular point in time, you're going to get an estimate for where the monkey's brain state is at that point in time in this 2-dimensional space defined by these 2 vectors, which have been derived from the overall brain signal to represent forward motion specifically. And what you can see is that this ended up working pretty well, really, because when we look at the forward motion plane, the plane that's being described by the 2 forward vectors, you can see that the projection of the neural activity forms a nice regular ellipse. And that's what we see in the green line. But when we project activity that's being recorded during backward motion trials, those trials where the environment is that tan color and the monkey's turning the pedal backwards, then you can see that projection into the forward plane is a little scribble in the middle. There's no smooth elliptical motion. And the exact opposite is true when we look in the backward plane. So projecting the neural activity into the backward plane when the monkey is in fact moving backwards gives us a nice elliptical motion. But projecting activity that was collected while the monkey was moving in the forward direction into the backward plane creates, again, a little scribble in the middle of the plane. No discernible regular motion of any kind. And this is really fundamentally different from trying to decode the overall X and Y positions. And a really big fundamental difference is that we've got different sets of neural representations depending on whether the monkey is moving their hand in the forward direction or in the backward direction. Now, to take a look at what this functionally turned out, we can get an estimate of the angular velocity in each of these planes. How many degrees of rotation happens from one point in time to another point in time in each of these forward and backward planes. Now, you can look in this graph and you can see on a single trial that in dark blue we see the backward angular momentum, in light blue we see the forward angular momentum, and in black we see the true rotation that the monkey is executing with their hand. Now, really importantly, unlike when we use the traditional variables, there's no situation now where the monkey is intending to keep their hands still, but the decoder is predicting motion. And there's also no situation where there's forward motion when in fact the monkey is moving backwards. And part of the reason for this is because having separate planes of prediction for forward motion and backward motion has really managed to orthogonalize the two types of motion, the forward and the backward motion. So this was working really well. And when we look at it on an actual behavioral output kind of a level, rather than just looking at it in these really quite theoretical neural spaces of forward and backward motion, what we can see is that the monkeys did very, very well. So in the y-axis of these graphs, we're looking at monkey success. And on the x-axis, we're looking at different sessions, different experimental days or sessions. And in the pink dots, the filled in dots, you can see the brain-machine interface sessions. So these are sessions where the monkey is driving the motion through the virtual environment using only their neural signals. They can move their hand, but their hand isn't driving their motion through the virtual environment. And then by contrast, we can see in the open circles the sessions where the monkey is driving themselves through with their hand motion. And the really important thing to see here is that they're really basically the same. Both of the monkeys that were involved in this experiment are successfully driving through the virtual environment using nothing but their minds. So there were a couple of other elements that Shroeder and her colleagues used to augment their model. Specifically, they had another prediction variable that was looking at whether or not whether the monkey was moving or stopped. Another one that looked for initiation of motion, and another one that tried to decode the initial stage of motion after motion had only just begun. And when all of these things were put together, it created this amazing, super accurate model. The thing that was a little frustrating, though, was that it was kind of ad hoc. You know, each of these separate aspects that was being decoded had a slightly different mathematical approach. So there didn't seem to be a consistent way that they were managing to key in on what the key variables really were. But it worked really well. One of the key issues, as we talked about earlier, if you think about using technology like this to drive a wheelchair, is that you have to have a situation where there's never a false start. If the person wants to stay still, they have to stay still. They can't accidentally start moving. And in the experiments that we're talking about now, it turned out that for one of the monkeys, there was a 0.29%. So only about 1 in 300 or so trials that the monkey would start moving when, in fact, the monkey had not intended to. And for the other monkey, this same percentage was 0.09%, so about 1 in 1,000. This is pretty good. This is far better than would have been achievable using traditional decoding variables like x position and y position. So I think all of this then leaves us with a couple of questions. First, if the traditional variables like x position, y position are so bad, why did the reach experiments work? And the second question, what does this tell us about the brain? As we talked about, this decoding algorithm that Shroeder and her colleagues came up with was kind of ad hoc, with several different mathematical approaches being combined into one really effective algorithm. But still, what does it tell us about neural coding at any kind of a deeper level? So Shroeder and her colleagues had an answer to these questions. And what they think is going on is that there's actually fundamentally different neural coding for different tasks. Now, how these different languages of internal neural communication might be implemented, it's not really clear. But it reminds me a little bit of a paper out of Earl Miller's lab about 10 years ago. And what he did there was he had monkeys that were trying to use the same set of stimuli, but depending upon the context of the task, those stimuli had different meanings. And what he found was that fundamentally different groups of neurons, totally different cells, were responsible for signaling the differences between stimuli in one context versus in another context. Something like this could be going on with motor tasks, where entirely different sets of cells are responsible for the neural communication depending upon what task is being involved. Now, of course, a tricky thing is when you stick electrodes into the brain, one electrode could be recording from many different neurons. So the signal that a single electrode picks up, although it's shifting from one neuron to another in one task and another, it might not be possible for the algorithm to know that it's actually listening to different neurons. So this is going to be a big challenge. More generally, the results from Shroeder and her colleagues show us that it might be necessary to develop separate, bespoke algorithms for every single task that you want a brain-machine interface to be able to accomplish. And these different algorithms might not really generalize very well from one task to another, or even to edge cases of a single particular task, making it seem like it's going to end up being a very slow slog to get the full range of brain-machine interface operations that we might want. Now, that said, I do think that we're going to see pretty quick progress on allowing people with paralysis to drive cursors and click and type using nothing but their mind. Now, the reason I think this is because we can already see it being done. It's possible to get monkeys to drive cursors using their motor cortex, so I have no doubt that it'll be possible to do it with humans. And now that Neuralink has made technology that can be implemented, that can be installed in a human skull pretty easily, I don't think that there's going to be too much holding it back from being deployed on a large scale. That said, though, more complicated operations like maybe playing a computer game using only your mind, driving around in a virtual environment like we saw in this experiment, these types of things I think are going to take a lot longer. But there's also some reason for hope and some interesting take-homes from this. And I think what we can see here is that Shroeder and her colleagues are showing us a new approach. You want to look for the variance in the neural signal and use that to inform the choice of algorithm and the design of algorithm. It doesn't really make sense to try and come up with an idea for how you think the brain is coding information based on your external observations and then try and force that idea upon the brain. You're going to end up almost always in a situation where you're trying to draw a very tiny amount of the brain's total variance into your algorithm. Much more productive, as shown here, is that you can follow the brain's natural variance and develop algorithms that utilize that variance and can really capture the most information out of the neural signal that's possible. So I think that's the really exciting thing out of this paper, is showing that it is possible to overcome these task switching code changes. You just have to look for the variance. So anyway, that's it for this video. Hope you liked it. Hope you like the better sound quality and me coming to you from this strange disembodied black void. But yeah, still a work in progress. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, please like, please comment. I'd love to hear what you guys think of the video. And if you're really liking the content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. All right, thanks. Bye.